He didn't shake her hand at the closing. Ellery Bowen noticed it before she noticed anything else. Not the stack of documents spread across the mahogany table, not the way the afternoon light was coming in sideways through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the law firm's boardroom. Not even the woman in the cream blazer sitting beside her husband. She noticed that he didn't shake her hand. 14 years. She had been married to Donovan Bowen for 14 years, and somewhere in those 14 years he had apparently stopped thinking she was worth a handshake. The papers were for the house on Cartier Avenue. Their house. The one she had found, the one she had renovated corner by corner while Donovan was in Calgary closing deals. The one where she had painted the nursery twice because the first shade of yellow turned out too harsh under the morning light. The sale was going through. Donovan had decided that. The money, all of it, was going into an investment fund that, as of 6 months ago, she had learned did not have her name on it. Ellery signed where the notary pointed. She always signed where people pointed. That was, everyone would later agree, her single most defining character flaw. She had grown up in Burlington, Ontario, the kind of place where people mowed their lawns on Saturday mornings and didn't ask too many questions about their neighbors. Her father had been a civil engineer, and her mother had taught French immersion at the local elementary school, and they had raised Ellery to be practical, sensible, and quietly competent at everything she attempted. She was not raised to make scenes. She was not raised to suspect people she loved. She had met Donovan at a fundraising gala for a children's hospital in downtown Toronto. She was 31, working as a pharmaceutical licensing consultant, recently promoted, newly confident in a way she hadn't quite grown into yet. He was 38, a commercial real estate developer, the kind of man who filled a room without seeming to try. He asked her to dance twice. He remembered her drink order without being told. He called the next morning. Looking back, she could see that she had confused competence for character. The two things can look almost identical from a certain distance. They married 2 years later. She moved her consulting practice to accommodate his schedule. She managed their social life, their travel, the renovation of the Cartier Avenue house, the slow accumulation of a life that looked, from the outside, very much like success. What she hadn't known, what she had trusted completely without verifying, was that Donovan had been moving assets for years, not all at once. That was the thing about men like Donovan. They didn't do it all at once. They did it piece by piece, slowly enough that no single moment looked like betrayal, only like a minor adjustment, a small administrative decision, a business necessity. By the time Ellery's name was removed from the third joint account, she was so accustomed to signing documents without reading them carefully that she had almost forgotten her name had ever been there. She found out through a filing error, specifically through a tax document that was mailed to the house instead of to Donovan's office, which happened because their accountant, a meticulous man named Gerald, who had served them both for 11 years and who would eventually feel very bad about all of this, had the wrong mailing address on file. Ellery opened it without thinking. It was addressed to Donovan Bowen, principal shareholder, Bowen Meridian Holdings, Inc. She had never heard of Bowen Meridian Holdings, Inc. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time with that piece of paper in her hands. The afternoon light moved across the floor. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a child was riding a bicycle up and down the sidewalk, making a small sound each time they passed the crack in the pavement. She did not call Donovan. She called a woman named Cécile Tremblay, a family law lawyer in Mississauga who had been her university roommate's older sister and who Ellery had once sat across from at a Christmas dinner and thought, "I hope I never need her professionally." She needed her professionally. Cécile had a corner office on the 14th floor with a view of the lake and the kind of calm in her voice that came not from indifference, but from having seen nearly everything at least twice. She listened to Ellery without interrupting. She looked at the tax document. She asked 3 specific questions, took 3 specific notes, and then she leaned back and said, "Tell me everything you've signed in the last 4 years." It took 2 hours. By the end of it, Cécile's notepad was half full. She set her pen down with a particular kind of deliberateness. Not the deliberateness of someone who had nothing to say, but the deliberateness of someone choosing exactly which thing to say first. "You signed over the Cartier Avenue proceeds in March," Cécile said. "I thought it was going into our retirement fund. It went into Bowen Meridian, which is solely in his name. She paused. There's also the property in Collingwood. Ellery went very still. She hadn't thought about the Collingwood property in years. It was a piece of land she had inherited from her grandmother. 4.5 acres on the escarpment, nothing on it but spruce trees and a small creek, worth very little when she'd received it, and worth considerably more now because of a conservation easement agreement that had been negotiated, apparently, without her awareness, by a law firm she didn't recognize. That property, Cecile said carefully, is still in your name. I didn't know anyone was negotiating anything on it. You didn't sign anything on it? No, never. Cecile looked at her for a moment. Then it's yours, entirely. No joint ownership, no liens, no encumbrances that I can see from preliminary review. She folded her hands. Ellery, do you know what that land is worth right now? She didn't. She'd never thought to check. She found out the next morning. She sat with the number for a very long time. What happened next did not happen quickly. This was the part that Ellery would later explain to people who asked. Friends, her sister in Guelph, her mother who cried quietly on the phone and then apologized for crying, that it did not happen the way it happens in films. There was no single confrontation. There was no dramatic moment in a restaurant with witnesses. There was simply a period of about 11 weeks, during which Ellery went to work, came home, made dinner, spoke to Donovan about ordinary things, and met with Cecile every Tuesday afternoon. Donovan didn't notice. He was, during this period, occupied. There was a woman named Petra who worked in his firm's marketing department. Ellery knew her only as the person who had redesigned their quarterly reports and who had, at the firm's Christmas party 2 years ago, laughed a little too warmly at something Donovan said. She was 32. She had a very good blowout and the particular ease of someone who has not yet learned what they're capable of losing. Ellery had found out about Petra the same way she'd found out about Bowen Meridian. By accident, by a piece of information arriving in the wrong place. A dinner reservation confirmation sent to the shared family email account that Donovan had apparently forgotten they still shared. The restaurant was in Yorkville, the kind of place where you needed to book 6 weeks in advance. The reservation was for 2. The date was their anniversary. She forwarded it to Cecile without comment. Cecile had forwarded it to her own file without comment. The Collingwood property sat under 4.5 acres of silence while all of this was happening. Ellery had driven up to see it in October, on a Tuesday when Donovan thought she was in Hamilton for a client meeting. She had parked on the gravel shoulder and walked the perimeter of the land in her good boots, which were entirely wrong for walking through long grass in October, and she had stood at the edge of the creek and listened to the water moving over the stones. Her grandmother had bought this land in 1974 for $11,000. She had never built on it. She had left it to Ellery with a note that said only, "Keep what's yours." Ellery had thought at the time that it was a strange thing to say about 4.5 acres of spruce trees. She understood it now. The conservation easement that had been negotiated, by whom, and through what arrangement she still wasn't entirely certain, had made the land significantly more valuable to a specific category of buyer. Cecile had connected her with a commercial land consultant named Roger, who had very dry hands and an extremely matter-of-fact way of delivering large numbers. And Roger had explained that there was a development consortium in Barrie that had been trying to acquire the adjacent parcel for 2 years, and that Ellery's 4.5 acres were, in the context of that particular consortium's plans, not incidental. They were essential. "They've been looking for a way in," Roger said, spreading a survey map across his desk. "Your property gives them the access corridor they need. Without it, their project doesn't work." Ellery looked at the map for a long moment. "What happens if I don't sell?" Roger looked at her over his reading glasses. "Then their project doesn't work." She drove home. She did not mention any of this to Donovan. The divorce was filed on a Wednesday in November. Donovan received the papers at his office, which Cecile had chosen deliberately. Not cruelly, just strategically. He called Ellery 4 times within the first hour. She let all 4 calls go to voicemail. She was in Cecile's waiting room with a cup of tea that had gone cold, watching the light change on the lake. His first voicemail said he didn't understand what was happening. His second said they needed to talk. His third said she was being irrational. His fourth said she had no idea what she was throwing away. She listened to all four of them once, and then set her phone face down on the chair beside her. When Cecile came out of her office, she sat down across from Ellery and said, "His lawyer called. They want to negotiate." "They always want to negotiate when they're surprised," Ellery said. She had learned this from Cecile over 11 Tuesdays. "They're claiming Bowen Meridian was a legitimate separate business enterprise." It is. It's also the repository for approximately $400,000 that was removed from joint accounts over the last 3 years. Ellery picked up her cold tea. "Cecile, what's the value of the Collingwood land right now if the consortium deal goes through?" Cecile named a number. Ellery set down her tea. "And if it doesn't?" She named a different number, still significant, but not the same. "Make sure his lawyers know both numbers," Ellery said. What Donovan had not understood, what he had perhaps never thought to verify. Because he had been relying for 14 years on the reasonable assumption that Ellery signed things without looking at them closely, was that the Collingwood property had never appeared in any of their joint financial disclosures, because Ellery had filed it separately as inherited personal property at the time of their marriage, on the advice of her father, who had been a practical man, on a form that Donovan had never asked to see. He had known about the land. He had simply never thought to account for it. This was, Cecile explained to the opposing counsel in a meeting that Ellery did not attend but heard about in detail afterward, a fairly significant oversight. The meeting where everything changed was on a Tuesday in late November, in a boardroom in the financial district, that felt very similar to the one where she had signed the Carthay Avenue papers, except that this time Ellery had read everything before she sat down. Donovan was there with his lawyer, a man named Forsyth, who had small, precise handwriting and the kind of aggressive stillness that made Ellery think of a coiled spring. Petra was not there, which was either a concession or a strategic choice. Probably both. Donovan did not meet Ellery's eyes when she came in. He looked at the table, then at Forsyth, then at a point somewhere above her left shoulder. He was wearing a suit she had bought him 2 Christmases ago. Cecile set a document down on the table. Not the settlement agreement, that came later. This was a summary. A summary of the Collingwood property's assessed value, its significance to the Barry Consortium's development plans, and the timeline of its acquisition by Ellery's grandmother. Attached was a letter from Roger the consultant, and a letter from the consortium's representatives, confirming that they were prepared to move forward with Ellery as the sole negotiating counterpart. Forsyth picked it up. He read it. He set it down. "My client has been under the impression," Forsyth said, "that the inherited property was a shared marital asset." "Your client's impression," Cecile said, "is not supported by the documentation filed with their prenuptial financial disclosure." There had been no prenuptial agreement, technically, but there had been a financial disclosure schedule. There always was. Donovan's lawyer had not, apparently, gone back and read it. Forsyth and Donovan exchanged a look. It was the kind of look that contains an entire conversation, none of it pleasant. Ellery poured herself a glass of water from the carafe at the center of the table. "I'm prepared to settle this efficiently," Ellery said. "I've been prepared for 11 weeks. She set down the glass. "But I need the Bowen Meridian transfers fully disclosed and fully remediated. All of them. The account statements, the transfer dates, the amounts." Gerald has already provided his records to Cecile's office. Donovan looked at her then. For the first time since she'd walked into the room, he actually looked at her. And she could see, quite clearly, with a calm that surprised even her, that he was trying to calculate something. Trying to figure out how much she knew, how long she'd known it, what the gap was between what he'd assumed and what was actually true. She let him calculate. "I want a full accounting," she said, "and I want it in writing before the end of this week." Forsyth asked for a recess. They stepped out into the hallway. Cecile leaned over to Ellery and said, very quietly, "You're doing well." "My hands are shaking," Ellery said. "That's fine. Keep them under the table." They sat in silence for a moment. Through the glass wall of the boardroom, Ellery could see Forsyth on his phone. Donovan standing with his back to the room, looking out the window. He had his hands in his pockets. She had always thought it made him look relaxed. She understood now that it was something he did when he was nervous. She had been married to this man for 14 years, and she could read his body language across a glass partition in a boardroom in the financial district, and she was reading it correctly, and the thing she was reading was, he did not see this coming. She had signed everything he put in front of her for 14 years. He had stopped seeing her. The settlement took 3 weeks to finalize. It was not simple, and it was not painless, but it was thorough. The Bowen Meridian transfers were disclosed, all of them, and the remediation was structured as a lump sum payment from Donovan's personal holdings, separate from the business entity, which Cecile had insisted on, and which Forsyth had argued against for the better part of an afternoon before conceding. The Cartier Avenue proceeds were partially recoverable under the constructive trust argument Cecile had built across 11 Tuesday afternoons. The retirement accounts were divided equitably. The Collingwood property remained entirely Ellery's. It had never been anything else. She signed the consortium agreement in January. Roger was there, dry hands and reading glasses, and Cecile was there, and a representative from the consortium named Hartwell, who shook her hand firmly and looked her directly in the eye when he talked to her. The number on the agreement was the larger of the two numbers Cecile had named. The deal had gone through. Her grandmother had bought that land in 1974 for $11,000. Ellery thought about that on the drive back from the signing. Northbound on the 400, gray January sky, salt spray from the trucks ahead of her, the particular relief of a thing that has been held very tightly finally being set down. She thought about her grandmother, who had kept a garden and taught herself bookkeeping in her 40s and never explained her decisions to anyone who didn't ask. She thought about the note that had come with the property. Keep what's yours. She had not understood at the time that keeping something required active effort, that it was not a passive state, that you had to know what you had and watch it, and sometimes you had to sit across a boardroom table from the person who wanted to take it and say, quietly and without shaking, I've read everything, and I want it in writing. She moved into a rental in the annex in February, a second-floor apartment in a narrow Victorian house, with tall ceilings and original hardwood and a small window in the kitchen that looked out over a backyard where the landlord kept a very determined bird feeder. She liked it. She liked the height of the ceilings and the sound the floors made, and the particular light that came in through that kitchen window on winter mornings, low and clear and unobstructed. She was not happy, exactly, not yet. But she was present in a way she hadn't been in years. Present in the specific sense of being inside her own life, and aware of it, not simply managing it from a careful distance. Her sister drove up from Guelph the first weekend, and they had dinner at a small Portuguese place on Bloor and talked for 4 hours. Her mother stopped crying on the phone and started asking practical questions, which was how Ellery knew she was going to be fine. Gerald, the accountant, sent a formal letter of apology that was clearly written by a lawyer, but which she believed was also sincere. She didn't hear from Donovan again, not directly. She heard through the particular social osmosis of mutual acquaintances that he and Petra had moved in together in a condo in Liberty Village. She heard this without feeling anything in particular, which was itself a kind of answer about what she had and hadn't actually lost. In March, she drove up to Collingwood on a Saturday. Not for any business reason. The consortium had everything they needed. She went because she wanted to see it one more time before the access corridor work began. She parked on the gravel shoulder. She walked the perimeter again in better boots this time, waterproof ones she had bought specifically for this trip, which felt like a small but meaningful act of preparation. The creek was higher than it had been in October, still moving fast with the early melt. The spruce trees were doing what spruce trees do in March, which is to say they were waiting, patient and dark green, for the winter to finish. She stood at the edge of the creek for a while. She was 39 years old. She had signed things for 14 years without reading them carefully enough, and she had trusted without verifying, and she had been wrong about a man she'd thought she knew. All of that was true. None of it had taken the land. None of it had been able to touch the one thing she had held without knowing she was holding it. The water moved over the stones. She turned and walked back to the car. She had a meeting in the city Monday morning. A new client. A licensing agreement in the pharmaceutical sector. Her own name on the consulting contract in clean black ink. On the way back down the 400, she stopped for coffee at a Tim Hortons near Barry, the kind of stop stop she'd made 100 times on this drive, and she sat at a small table by the window with a medium dark roast and watched the transport trucks pass on the highway and felt, for the first time in longer than she could precisely account for, entirely like herself.